and welcome back to another episode of the Be Brave podcast with me, your host, Grace. Today I will be joined by the amazing Bianca Skillbeck, clinical hypnotherapist, counsellor, provisional psychologist, and founder of Freedom from Food. Together, we will discuss the uses of hypnotherapy in treatment of eating disorders, whilst also talking a bit about Bianca's experience of mental ill health and eating disorder and recovery. So, without further ado, here is Bianca. Hey Bianca, thank you so much for joining me today. I'm so excited to have you on the podcast.
Thanks for the invite. Yeah, I'm excited to have a discussion.
Before we dive into today's topic, I would love it if you could tell us a little bit about yourself. For example, if you have pets or hobbies.
I do have a pet actually next to me. Occupied by her peanut butter on the licky mat right now, which is a strategy, is my toy poodle, Ollie. So I spend a lot of time with Ollie. She's about 18 months old, still kind of got a lot of puppy energy, so she keeps me pretty busy. Hobbies, when I've got time, I will do a lot of reading. I enjoy reading, going to the movies. I go to boxing. So I've got a few different things, but I am kept pretty busy by study and work at the moment. So yeah, we see what time we've got for those things.
Yeah, absolutely. Your dog sounds like such a cutie though.
She is. She's very cute. She's keeps me very busy, but she's worth it.
Now that we know a little bit about you, would you mind sharing a bit about your own experience with mental ill health and recovery?
Yeah, sure. So I'm in my late 30s now, and I guess my story probably starts when I was pretty young. I suppose maybe around. I guess it's been a few things. Where do I sort of start? So looking back, I think I was a fairly anxious sort of child. That was expressed in a few different ways. I mean, I think just pretty typical symptoms of anxiety that didn't really get talked about, back, in that time. I suppose, I grew up in the sort of, late 80s, early 90s, that sort of thing. Talk about mental health was not necessarily something that was all that fluent, back in the day. But I can see that there was anxiety present, when I was a kid, and that sort of translated into a few different things as I was growing up. It started with actually skin picking, which is an interesting one that I sometimes talk to people about, and also, not uncommon. I see a lot of clients now with that. There's an overlap there with some of the eating disorder stuff as well. But yeah, so I started with some skin picking stuff, which very much, followed me into my, all through my adolescence and early 20s. Became disordered eating from probably about the age of, 10 was the earliest signs really, where I started restricting and, just sort of playing with that idea of, skipping meals and trying to change my body and having particular thoughts about, body image and self-worth and all of that sort of thing. Into adolescence, there were certain time periods where I really doubled down on that restriction. So you could say that, it was certainly a diagnosable eating disorder at points, and that sort of shape shifted over time. Started out as a restrictive eating disorder, but I think into my, probably late teens and early 20s, it became more of a binge restriction kind of presentation as well. And there's been several things along the way, I suppose. I guess mental health exists all along a spectrum, and we all have our bad days still. So it's not as if, there gets to be a point where we're completely out of the woods. But I think that, as time has gone on, and I've become more aware of, the reasons why I might have experienced the things that I've experienced, become more aware of, ways that I can think about these things, strategies that I can implement to, look after myself better. I, think that, things are on the up. But yeah, it's certainly been a journey over time.
Yeah, sounds like you've really been through the wars with your mental health and experienced quite a few hardships, but it's good to hear that things are on the up.
Yeah, well, I mean, I don't like to paint, sort of unrealistic picture, I think, of what mental health can be for some people. I think that, for whatever reason, some people tend to, suffer a little bit more than others. There's nothing wrong with that. It's just about, putting in the work, I suppose.
Yeah.
Getting that self-awareness, finding strategies for yourself, and not expecting perfection. That even if you do overcome particular difficulties in life, that still you're not going to just have every day be really amazing. It's just not realistic, is it? So I think I've got a fairly realistic picture these days of mental health and what to expect from it, and just how to self-care around that.
Yeah. Well, moving into a bit further today's topic, so you're obviously in the field of hypnotherapy. How did you get into that field?
Yeah, it's a bit obscure, I suppose. So right now I'm doing my master's in clinical psychology, and interestingly enough, that was actually a path that started a couple of decades ago at this point. So straight out of school, when I was 18, I did enroll in a psychology degree, which I quickly dropped out of because I realized I wasn't ready at the time. Such a young age when you're, sort of 17, 18, to be taking on that kind of study, I think. But nonetheless, I did a couple of months of my psychology degree before I dropped out. Interestingly enough, there was a lecture that mentioned hypnotherapy, really quite surprising, I suppose, considering that this was a couple of decades ago. There was a lecture that was taught, and the lecturer mentioned hypnotherapy as a particular tool that could be used in therapy and in mental health, and it kind of piqued my interest at that point. So this was back when I was actually, I might have even been 17 because I finished school a little bit early. So, the first couple of months of uni, I sort of heard about hypnotherapy and thought, oh, that's an interesting thing. Maybe I'll come back to that one day. And I did.
Wow. And then for those who don't know, would you mind briefly explaining what hypnotherapy is?
Yeah, so I think these days of hypnotherapy is a bit of an umbrella term, I suppose. Because there's lots of techniques and different things that you can do in a hypnotic state, to help people. So a lot of people think of hypnosis and they think of like stage hypnosis, I suppose. Stage shows can be really fun. I've seen a few of them myself. They're, very entertaining. But of course, it's very different to what we do in the therapy context. So hypnosis in and of itself is really just a state of, perhaps you might say altered consciousness, where a person will become more focused, more in the zone, more just focused on I guess what we're doing and what we're trying to process at the time. And typically a session of hypnotherapy, although there are many different kinds of techniques that can be used, typically in a session people will close their eyes and they might start to imagine different things. There might be visualization components. They might start to really tap into the emotions in their body and start to describe the different things that they're experiencing. And we use all of that information just to try to help people to process some of their emotions, become more aware of some of their emotions, start to name and talk about some of this stuff, and ultimately get some shifts in how they're feeling and thinking about things that are not as easy to get in just sort of straight up talk therapy.
Yeah. Wow. I love as well how you're saying it's a way to be a bit more in tune with your own body and your thoughts, because I think a lot of people may think of hypnosis as something that's being done to you, whereas you're describing it as a sort of introspective process, which sounds really helpful.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I'm glad you said it like that, because I think that because of how hypnosis can be used on stage, people do think of it as this thing that is done to them. But actually in the therapeutic context, it's a collaborative kind of process. It's where I think of it as a bit of a somatic type therapy as well. Like we're really getting a person to, get in touch with what's going on for them in their mind, in their body, and, just make those connections that otherwise they might not be able to necessarily make.
Yeah, absolutely. And so how do you then go about using hypnotherapy with clients with eating disorders?
Yeah, so it's I suppose it's become a bit of a refined process. Like the more and more years that I've done it, of course, we start to get familiar with what is appropriate, what works, what people need, all of that sort of thing. And everybody's very different. Whenever I see a new person, I take them as an individual case and I figure out what they specifically need, because everybody's different. But overall, typically when I actually see clients these days, we don't do hypnotherapy like straight away. Often people do come to me because they are interested in that. That's something that's kind of piqued their interest as well, and maybe they've tried lots of other things, and so they just want to try something different. And that's absolutely fair enough, of course. But typically, we might spend the first few sessions just doing some like straight up counselling, talk therapy, just so as I can get a bit of a handle and a bit of an idea on what is actually happening for them in their lives. You know, what they've tried, what's worked, what's not worked, what some of their beliefs are, all of that sort of thing. And sometimes there's a bit of behavioural stuff that we might even need to engage first, you know, before we actually do some hypnosis. Particularly when people come in with, you know, binge purge type presentations. There are some things that I like us to sort of work on before we do hypnotherapy because I mean, basically put it this way. If somebody comes, you know, in with a binge presentation, often what's happening is that there's a lot of restriction, you know, that's going on in their lives, whether that's literal physical restriction or even that mental restriction of, you know, beating themselves up about how they eat or whatever. And often the binge is coming from a place of hunger. And so I don't want to, you know, use hypnotherapy to stop people from binging when they're binging because they're hungry, because they're restricting. So, you know, often we want to sort of unpack a little bit of that stuff first before we go straight into the hypnosis. So people are usually pretty happy about that idea for us to, you know, work through a few things in some sessions of counselling first. And once we start to get eating a little bit more stable, or at least we start to you know, figure out, I guess, why, you know, a person might be experiencing what they're experiencing, then we can use hypnosis to, you know, basically address any barriers or blocks that they still might be experiencing at that point. And often we're looking at things like maybe things like grief and loss or trauma, you know, really deep-seated, you know, core beliefs about the self. Often people have very strong parts of them that are, you know, sort of enacting different behaviors in their life. So they might have one part of them that's bringing them into therapy and really wants this thing to get better, but then another part of them that really doesn't want it to change at all because this is their current coping strategy. So, you know, in hypnotherapy, we might be looking at those different parts as well, and getting those parts to actually communicate and negotiate in better ways, more healthy ways for the person.
Yeah. Really interesting as well that you talk about it as different parts of yourself, because I know it's quite common for people to talk about it as an eating disorder and yourself as separate entities, whereas for a lot of people that's quite challenging because it feels like part of yourself. And so recognizing that these maybe are two parts or multiple parts of yourself and addressing those.
Absolutely, yeah. I think that you know, a lot of traditional eating disorder treatment can sort of conceptualize, you know, the eating disorder as almost this like external force, this thing that we need to kick out, this thing that we need to sort of fight and stamp down, and you know, make it go away, kind of thing. But I don't really see it that way. I mean, I understand why people think of it that way, but I sort of see it a bit differently. I tend to think of the eating disorder part of people as, you know, a part of them that's trying to be helpful. It's trying to achieve something here. Usually that's, you know, addressing feelings of, you know, low self-worth, depression, anxiety. You know, it's actually trying to lift the person up in some kind of way. But of course, you know, the way that it's going about that is destructive, but the intention is not bad. And I think that, you know, the eating disorder part of a lot of people is often one of the strongest parts of them that we can actually utilize, you know, for good in their lives. We can, you know, if we can kind of harness that energy and direct it towards something that's really valuable to the person and get them to actually, you know, maybe like understand and realize what that is for them, then, you know, that's a much better force for good.
Yeah, absolutely. And so using hypnotherapy, and you've said you use a bit of talk therapy as well, how do you find that hypnotherapy differs from other approaches like CBT or FBT?
Yeah. I think of hypnotherapy, and this is just my personal interpretation, it might not be what other hypnotherapists say. I suppose everybody starts to develop their own styles over time. But I think of hypnotherapy as a more somatic-based therapy, like where it's more emotion-focused, I think. getting a person to connect their thoughts with their emotions and actually be present in their bodies, and start to describe, like, what does it feel like when I have anxiety? What does my body actually feel like? How, what are the messages, that are coming through at that point? And it's not to say, I suppose, that other therapies like CBT don't do that. But I think hypnotherapy does that in a more focused sort of way.
Yeah. Really helpful to just really get in tune and think of it from another place.
Yeah, and often, there's wisdom, in our bodily experiences. We can get really in our heads about this stuff, especially if you're somebody that, experiences an eating disorder. That's typically a very in one's head kind of presentation. We can, kind of become quite disembodied in a way. We can, really just, think that we are our thoughts and that's all there is to it. But in fact, our bodies will give us a lot of clues as to how we're feeling and maybe even why. And if we can start to make those connections, that can be a helpful thing.
Yeah, I think it must be really helpful as well, because I think with a lot of eating disorders, one of their purposes is to numb. And so there is this sort of fear and not wanting to get into emotions or feel those things in your body. And so by easing into it through hypnotherapy, I imagine it breaks down some of that fear and allows you to come into that again.
Yeah, I think that's a really nice way to put it.
Would you say with hypnotherapy, is there a specific demographic that would benefit more from hypnotherapy, or what's your opinion there?
Not necessarily, no. I think anybody that's open to it can benefit from it, really. I don't think there's any demographic, any age or gender or any other variable that matters more than just simply being open to the process. And in fact, if we think about the hypnotic state, which is just this this very sort of focused in the zone kind of state, it's a state that everybody is in every day from one moment to the next anyway, depending on what we're doing. When you're doing anything that you're really focused on or you love, and if we think about kids and how how they're constantly hypnotized until the age of they say about 7 or whatever. I don't know if that's exactly true for a cutoff, but if you think about little kids just running around in their own little world doing their own thing, they're just permanently hypnotized, and we don't lose that as adults. So it's just about tapping into that state where we're concentrating, we're in the zone, we're focused, and we're able to tap into some of what's going on with us.
Yeah, I've loved that you said that we don't lose it. I think a lot of people seem to think, I've lost it, it's gone now. But it's really more just about tapping back into it.
We become, especially I think in our culture and in our society, much, much more in our heads. The older and older we get, and the more that life requires that of us, we become quite disembodied and, very intellectualizing in our lives. And we, just get really wrapped up in all of that thoughts and cognition without remembering that there's also an embodied experience here to tap into.
Yeah. It's been so interesting talking with you today. Thank you so much for joining me. If there was only one thing that listeners took away from today's podcast, what would you want it to be?
Maybe that there is hope. I think that a lot of people might end up coming to see a practitioner like myself because I do something that's a little bit outside of the box. Hypnotherapy is not so common. It's becoming more common. More and more people have heard of it, or maybe they've used it, or they know somebody that has used it. But it's still one of those, sort of a little bit out of the box kinds of treatments. And a lot of people end up coming to me because they've, quote unquote, tried everything else. I think if there's anything that I'd like to convey to anybody, it's that there is hope. Eating disorders are not something that you have to live with forever. It's not something that, you can't recover from, despite what people might say. There is another way to do life.
I think that's such a beautiful message to end with. Thank you so much. I hope that you all enjoyed that conversation as much as I did. If you enjoyed this episode, it would be amazing if you would like to rate and review it and share it with your friends so that the Be Brave podcast can make its way to more people to show them that there is hope and that recovery is possible. Like always, don't forget that you are strong, you are worthy, and you are enough. Until next time, keep being brave.